Now in this section of the lecture, we're going to talk about those risks that we discussed before, but the differences between the domestic context and an international context. The difference between the domestic sale of a good and the international sale of a good. Now, in a domestic sale, risks are much more manageable. Parties are more easily able to manage the risks associated with that transaction. How so? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, both parties have access to a great deal of public information. That information is out there about anybody you're doing business with, and it is readily available. Maybe you've got to pay money for a credit report, or maybe you've got to spend some time doing some digging to see if this person's ever been sued, but that information is available and it's readily accessible. I could do a search of the entire United States federal court system to find out if some party has been sued. And it's not complicated and really not that expensive. So parties both have access to a great deal of public information. And it's very easy to inquire into the other party's reputation for honesty and dependability. Ask around. It's easy to ask around from either your competitors who've also done business with this company, or just people that are in the industry. So parties can ask about, are they honest? Are they dependable? Now, if there's a disagreement, and disagreements arise all the time, that's what this course is about, is how do we resolve those disputes. But if there's a disagreement, there's multiple opportunities to resolve the matter easily. Oftentimes through a face-to-face meeting. Maybe you're in the same town and you drive over there. Maybe you got to take a short flight of an hour or two to get there, but you could make that face-to-face meeting. There's phone calls, there's obviously electronic means. Everyone's carrying around a cell phone in their pocket that gives you access to video calls. So if a disagreement comes up, there's a lot of ways to resolve that in the domestic context. It's quite likely, again, in the domestic context, you're using the same language. There's no language issues at all. You're likely to use the same language. And in fact, the differences in state law, even if we are dealing with a company that's outside of our state, the differences in state law are actually relatively minor. We share across the United States, for reasons we'll explain in the next lecture, a common body of sales law. So a sales law in Oklahoma will be fundamentally the same sales law as in California, as in New Hampshire, as in North Dakota. We share the same sales law. And our court systems are very similar. All courts in the United States are organized in the exact same manner. All follow a very similar set of procedural rules. So even if our dispute accelerates to the place where we have to go to court, the differences in court systems are actually pretty minor. Courts tend to work the same. Now, in an international sale, of course, those risks are much higher. Of course, we start out with this knowledge. The expectations of the parties in an international sale are the same as in a domestic sale. All of those expectations that we discussed on the part of the buyer and of the seller, those are the same. But the risks associated with the meeting of those expectations are much higher. Obviously, communication is going to be much more difficult. Communication across time zones, communication in different languages. It's always difficult to communicate when people are outside of your country. Time zones can be a huge problem. We have a world where most of the world is organized on doing business during daylight hours, and those hours are going to change depending on where you are in the world. My brother actually lives in Thailand, and we speak occasionally on the phone, but our window of being able to call on the phone is really small because Thailand is 12 hours apart. And so I've pretty much got 8 to 10 in the morning and he's got 8 to 10 at night and vice versa. And those are really the only hours that we have available for communication. So unlike the United States, where we're in the same country and time zones are relatively minor distinctions, across international borders it can be much worse. And of course language, obviously we know, you've heard the international language of business is English, but nevertheless there's a lot of ambiguities that exist, ambiguities that arise all the time in domestic transactions as well. One of the examples that I always use is the use of the word next. When we talk about next Friday, I'm recording this on a Wednesday, so next Friday should be the day after tomorrow. But we know that most of us don't think of it in those terms. When I say next Friday, that tells you, oh, not this Friday that's coming up, but the one after that. Not the next Friday, but the next Friday after the Friday that's going to come up. So it's just an example of an ambiguity that exists even here in the States. So across language issues, something like next quarter, delivery to be made next quarter, well, what does that mean? There are other problems that arise in an international sale. Obviously, greater difficulty in determining trustworthiness if you haven't dealt with this company before and the people you know haven't dealt with the company. It may be hard to determine whether they're trustworthy or not. When you buy a product on eBay and the seller is in China, you have to ask yourself, is this seller trustworthy? Can I rely on this seller? Creditworthiness. Most international sales, most sale of goods in general, are done on credit. In the United States, it's very easy to check credit. You go down to the local credit bureau and ask for a report, and you get the report and you pay the money. And so it's easy to determine creditworthiness. Much more difficult in the international context. The risks of non-performance are going to be much greater. If there is on the part of the seller non-performance, meaning failed to ship the goods, well, if you're a buyer, getting those goods is going to be much more difficult. If you're a seller and the buyer fails to perform by not sending you the money, you have the chance of your goods going across the world, around the world, halfway around the world, and you've got nothing to show for it. So the risk of non-performance in an international transaction are much tougher. Time and distance are not simply stumbling blocks, but they're large obstacles. And in the next section of the, or in a separate lecture, I'm actually going to talk about the distinct types of risks that you will face when doing international sales transactions. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? In any sales transaction, the buyer and the seller are going to have expectations. In a domestic sales transaction, the risks are much more manageable. In an international sale, those risks are magnified. And that's it. As always, if you have any questions, be sure and email me, contact me, call me, let me know. Thanks.